Hi everyone. This week you will be exploring what your textbook's author calls the rhetorical shaping of gender. And so this week you're going to cover what she calls competing images of women, and then next week you will cover competing images of men. And I wanted to make a quick video to kind of tell you a little bit about what the purpose of these two chapters are, and maybe actually highlight one thing that I think is missing. Maybe in our next version this thing will show up. So the purpose behind these two chapters is it's a tone setting thing for the rest of the semester, and I'm going to get to that, what the tone, what the message kind of there is in a few minutes or a couple minutes. So what she's going to walk you through, if you haven't already done the reading, are different social movements, different historical social movements that have focused on people's gender. So specifically in this case, I mean, I've already said it, women and men. And they're like women's rights movements. Some of them have been labeled men's rights movements. Some of them are more broad than that. And so she's going to talk about feminism, and then she's going to talk about all kinds of other things, because there's all different types of feminism. There's a bunch of different movements that were related. There's some movements that are for women that aren't feminist movements at all. And similarly on the other, I like to think of them bookends because they're not the same coin really, but they're holding each other up. The men's movements are all over the spectrum in terms of their perspective. Like there's stuff about men's rights. I'll leave that to you to argue if that is something that is a problem in our society. You get to decide that for yourself. Or there's movements that are like men against violence. So it's a historical perspective that's going to allow you to kind of understand how we got to where we are today. Because it's really hard to understand that if you haven't explored, if you don't know anything about what came before. And a lot of this stuff is not stuff we were taught in grade school. I mean, I barely knew any of this in K through 12. So it's something we need to explore in order to really understand what gender means as a social construct. So as you go through this information, I want you to look for themes and patterns and connections between the different perspectives that are involved in each of these movements, because you're going to notice that there's definitely some overlap. And I want you to think about what issues specifically are many of these movements concerned about, because over and over again you're going to see, oh, violence, there's one. There are movements that are about ending violence on both sides of that. Women's movements that are about that, men's movements that are about that. Reproductive rights is another huge theme in all of these movements, regardless of their point of view on that. That's a huge concern. So I think one thing that's going to help you make sense out of these couple chapters is looking for the themes and the commonalities. And they might have different perspectives about reproductive rights, but they're all not all of them, but many of them are going to address that. So think about what are their concerns. Civil rights would be another one. And then I also want you to look for connections and or reactions to movements. So some of the movements were movements that are responses to each other, like like first wave feminism became second wave feminism, became third wave, and actually now we're kind of, a lot of people, myself included, will argue we're just starting a fourth wave that's a lot different than, it's an evolution. So some of them kind of gave birth, for lack of a better term, to other movements, and then some of them are reactions, like the men's rights movement, the ones that are like about the oppression of men. Those are definitely a response to modern day feminism. I mean, those people are angry about women having any power at all. So they have had, it feels to them like now, like they're oppressed. So they're a reaction to that. Whereas some of the men's anti-violence movements are a different type of reaction. They're like, you know what, that turns out they feel like feminists were right, and we need to learn how to change the conversation about violence in our culture, and here's one way to do it. So I want you to look for reactions and perspectives, and that's going to give you some insight into each one of the movements that I think will be really useful. And when it comes down to this, what it comes down to is what you're going to start thinking about is, it's a tone setting chapter in a sense for how to think about the content as we go forward, and for getting an understanding for how we arrived at modern perspectives, and also to be able to start identifying some like cultural reasons that underlie oppressions in our culture. Because some of the things that we're going to talk about in the next few chapters, like in the gendered education chapter, in the chapter that's on the workplace, we're going to start talking about the ways that gender has been used to marginalize people. And I don't just mean specifically women, although clearly that's maybe a more common conversation to have. But women have been marginalized, men have been marginalized in certain situations, um, trans people, I mean, just a whole host of issues. So that's the purpose of these chapters, is to kind of get you to start thinking about that and to have a historical perspective. So I hope that that helps you understand why you're reading these two chapters, and I hope these chapters are interesting. Oh, and the other thing that I almost forgot to mention is the newest version of the textbook, she tries to incorporate this, but it's not as strong as it could be. So I think that the kind of her glaring omission throughout the entire textbook is that there's not really much mention of gay rights in the queer community. Is just like a little bit in there. And in fact, there's a couple versions of the textbook where it's not addressed well. Like it's addressed in a problematic way. So she does a little bit better job every time she releases a new version of this book. But keep that in mind as you read this, that there is actually a whole other group that is barely even addressed in these two chapters. I mean, just splitting them into men and women is an interesting take that's maybe not the way that some of us would have set it up to begin with. So and if we're really going to talk about gender and marginalized groups, and then we're going to silence a group. So we're just going to pretend like they don't exist. Do not quote me on that, because that's obviously not what I meant. But I feel like that's a little bit what, I feel like it was too complicated of an issue for her to address. So she just chose not to do it. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of where we're headed.